Have you ever looked at the woman you love and wondered when she disappeared? She's still there, same smile, same scent, same voice that once wrapped around your spine like safety, but the presence behind her eyes has shifted. Where once there was invitation, now there's distance. Where once there was warmth, now calculation. And you feel it, not in anything she says, but in what she no longer gives freely. Now you're decoding silences. Now you're managing her mood like a thermostat you don't control. Now you're careful, too careful. You still call it love, but if you're honest, it's closer to obligation wrapped in fear of loss. And maybe you've asked yourself, what changed? Was it something you did? Something she outgrew? Something that time simply took? But the truth is more unsettling than that, because nothing changed. You just stopped believing the illusion. The softness you fell for, it was real, but it was also strategic, not malicious, not false, just adaptive. She gave you what would secure your investment, affection to lower your defenses, vulnerability to activate your protector instinct, desire to hook your validation, and you gave her what she needed, your attention, your stability, your willingness to reshape yourself. You thought love was happening. What was actually unfolding was an unspoken negotiation, your autonomy in exchange for her approval. But here's the deeper problem. You wanted to believe it. You needed to, because that performance wasn't just hers. It became yours. You liked who you got to be in her light. The provider, the protector, the man with a role. So you ignored the signals. You rationalized the withdrawals. You told yourself that compromise was noble, that sacrifice was strength. You weren't manipulated against your will. You were invited to surrender it, and you said yes. Not because you're weak, because you were trained to confuse emotional servitude with love. And once that dynamic is set, the decline begins. Subtle at first. You adjust to her moods, you give up parts of yourself, and eventually you forget what it felt like to want anything that didn't orbit her needs. This is where most men live, in relationships that began as connection but devolved into quiet control. And you keep telling yourself it's love, because the alternative would require a brutal admission that you were never chosen unconditionally. You were useful, then shaped, then tolerated, and the version of you she seemed to love was never entirely real. What men call emotional confusion, nature classified as strategy. Across evolutionary time, the direct exertion of power was inaccessible to women. Physical dominance, political control, overt assertion, these were male domains. To survive and secure resources, women refined a different skill set, psychological influence, not overt command, but covert conditioning, not confrontation, but atmosphere. Where men often seek to impose will on the world, women learn, often unconsciously, to shape the will of others. This isn't a question of intelligence or morality. It's not about blame, it's about method. Nature favors efficiency, and when strength is not an option, persuasion becomes survival. In modern relationships, this pattern persists, but it is masked beneath the language of affection. Most men never notice the process. They recall a woman who rarely gave orders, who never explicitly demanded change, but their behavior changed nonetheless. Gradually, almost imperceptibly. She didn't tell him what to wear, but disapproved in silence. She didn't forbid his hobbies, but withdrew warmth when he pursued them. She didn't argue, but softened when he complied, distanced when he didn't. He believed he was making free choices. In reality, he was being reshaped. This is not manipulation in the Hollywood sense, scheming, malicious intent. It's far more subtle than that. It's social intelligence operating below conscious awareness. Emotional climates are created. Affection is given and withheld with precision, and the man, sensing the temperature drop, adjusts, eager to restore harmony, unaware that he is no longer leading his own life. This is how influence works when direct power is unavailable. It doesn't dominate, it conditions. The term for this pattern, as noted in older philosophy, was the eternal feminine, not as goddess, not as muse, but as the invisible hand shaping male identity through emotional reward and withdrawal. The result is a kind of invisible domestication, not through conflict, but compliance. And because the woman rarely sees herself as exerting control, believing instead that she is simply reacting, the process remains hidden, even to her. But its effects are visible. Over time, the man begins to mirror her emotional landscape. His desires flatten, his voice softens, his time orbits her needs. He becomes useful, agreeable, unthreatening. And culturally, he is praised for this, called a good man, a partner, an evolved male. But beneath the praise lies a quieter truth. He is no longer sovereign. If emotional influence is the feminine method, moral conditioning is the masculine wound. The modern man has been trained, not by women but by the culture itself, to conflate virtue with surrender. From an early age, he is fed a narrative that love is sacrifice, that strength is suppression, that his highest value lies in how much of himself he's willing to give away. He internalizes this not through logic but through approval. Be gentle, be agreeable, make her feel safe. He is taught to ask not, "What do I want?" but "What will make her happy?" And beneath this, Nietzsche would argue, lies the machinery of slave morality, a value system designed to tame power by moralizing it. What once would have been called will, agency, or ambition is now reframed as selfishness, toxicity, or pride. So the man, in his desire to be good, makes himself smaller. He trades direction for diplomacy, purpose for peace. He becomes a relational servant, hoping that enough emotional labor will earn him love. But what he fails to see is that the very framework he is obeying was never designed for his liberation. It was designed to make him manageable. And women, socialized within the same framework, learn to expect this sacrifice not as a gift, but as a norm. Her need becomes the compass of the relationship. His strength becomes currency to spend on her emotional security. And if he withholds it, if he dares to assert independent desire, he is called distant, selfish, or emotionally unavailable. Nietzsche named this resentment, the resentment of strength disguised as virtue. It is not hatred of power, but the moral reframing of power as guilt. In relationships, this plays out quietly. The man who once had vision now waits for permission. He second-guesses his voice, he filters his truth. He begins to love not as a sovereign being, but as a supplicant, offering his selfhood in exchange for temporary emotional acceptance. And the tragedy is this: he believes he is doing the right thing. He believes this is love, but what he's actually enacting is a ritual of self-erasure, sanctified by cultural applause and rewarded with temporary intimacy. This is not what Nietzsche called love. This is moralized obedience, disguised as emotional maturity. Not all control looks like domination. In fact, the most effective form of control often looks like care. She doesn't shout, she doesn't demand. She simply changes the emotional weather, and the man, already trained to seek peace, already moralized into self-doubt, adjusts. This is the genius of what Nietzsche would recognize as moral tyranny. Not a confrontation of wills, but a system where one will is morally obligated to regulate itself in service of another's emotional comfort. She never says, "Don't go out." She just becomes quiet when you mention your plans. She doesn't forbid your ambitions. She simply wonders, gently, regretfully, how those ambitions might affect us. She doesn't demand your time. She becomes more vulnerable precisely when you try to reclaim it. Nothing is imposed. Everything is implied. And because the man has already internalized his role as emotional caretaker, he doesn't resist. He volunteers. He adapts not to avoid punishment, but to avoid disappointment. He tells himself he's being loving, supportive, emotionally available. But what's really happening is a progressive reorientation of will. His actions are no longer rooted in self-authorship. They are filtered through her emotional response. Every decision becomes a negotiation with how it might be received. Over time, his internal compass erodes. He no longer asks, "Is this right for me?" He asks, "Will this upset her?" And because the control is so diffuse, so wrapped in the language of love and concern, he cannot point to a single moment where he was coerced. He begins to feel it's his own failure, that he's not doing enough, that he's the source of the tension. This is the brilliance of emotional manipulation when masked as innocence. The one being controlled feels responsible for their own submission. Nietzsche warned of this evolution in morality, not from strength to weakness, but from force to guilt. As overt power became socially unacceptable, influence disguised itself as concern, and guilt replaced authority. The result is a relationship dynamic where the man is not overpowered, but overruled internally through emotional allegiance. And because she genuinely believes she is being loving, because the culture has sanctified her emotional needs as relational truth, there is no villain here, only a system where emotional authority migrates to the person most comfortable, making others feel responsible for their well-being. This is not partnership. This is emotional enclosure, and the longer he remains within it, the more he forgets that love was ever supposed to feel free. In relationships built on emotional control, both participants believe they're acting out of love. But what's actually unfolding is a mutual dependency system, concealed beneath the performance of care. He becomes responsible for her stability. She becomes central to his identity, and neither can grow because both are needed for the wrong reasons. Nietzsche called this a parasitic morality, a structure where weakness isn't healed but preserved. Not because either person is evil, but because both are benefiting from a quiet exchange of psychological permission. She gets to remain emotionally unstable. He gets to feel noble for managing it. This is the savior complex in its most seductive form. The man doesn't just tolerate her chaos, he's addicted to it. Her brokenness gives him purpose. Her need gives him status. Her instability gives him the illusion of strength. And so he becomes the emotional firefighter, constantly arriving at the scene of her latest crisis, never asking why the building keeps catching fire. But this isn't healing, this is performance, because a woman who truly wants to grow will respond to stability with gratitude, not escalation. Yet what most men fail to see is that some women are not seeking healing. They are seeking emotional dominance through instability. When her moods remain unpredictable, his attention remains fixed. When she requires constant reassurance, his energy remains available. When she plays the wounded figure, he remains cast as the rescuer. This dynamic protects both from self-confrontation. He never has to ask who he is without being needed. She never has to face who she is without being saved. And slowly, both atrophy. Nietzsche saw this as a form of arrested development, a refusal to transcend dependency because dependency feels meaningful. The man calls it love. But what he's really engaged in is emotional servitude, dignified by language but hollow at the core. He believes he's being compassionate, but compassion without boundaries becomes complicity. And over time, his desire to heal her becomes a strategy for avoiding himself. Because real intimacy demands more than caretaking. It demands two whole people who do not use each other as emotional prosthetics. In its absence, you get a closed system, two identities orbiting dysfunction, calling it devotion. This is the core of what Nietzsche would recognize as mutual parasitism. Each sustains the other's weakness to avoid confronting their own. And the relationship, though emotionally vivid, becomes a fortress against growth. Every system of control depends on participation. Once the man withdraws from his role, not in anger, not in protest, but in silence, the entire structure begins to fracture, not because he attacked it, but because he stopped feeding it. He no longer explains himself when she's upset. He no longer rearranges his world to avoid her disapproval. He stops seeking her emotional temperature as a guide for his actions. And in that space, something radical occurs. He reclaims authorship of his life. But this shift is not without consequence, because the moment a man reclaims his will, the relationship reveals its nature. If the connection was built on authenticity, the woman adapts. She rises, she self-reflects, she meets him in autonomy. But if the relationship was built on psychological leverage, she escalates. Emotional crises intensify, withdrawals become sharper. Accusations of abandonment or selfishness emerge, not because he did harm, but because he disrupted the emotional economy that had kept her in control. Nietzsche would see this moment as a form of spiritual emancipation, the beginning of self-overcoming. Not a rebellion against women, but a transcendence of the inner compulsion to be ruled by them. To be free not just in action, but in value. To no longer measure one's goodness by one's usefulness to another. But most men falter here. They mistake the escalation for a failure of empathy. They return to the role. They soothe. They apologize. And the old cycle begins again. The great separation, then, is not just from the woman. It is from the identity he constructed to gain her acceptance. That version of him, the compliant one, the emotional guardian, the willing subject, must die. And the man who emerges afterward is not harder. He is clearer. He does not hate women. He simply no longer obeys the gravity of their moods. He no longer chases harmony at the expense of truth. He no longer sacrifices sovereignty for proximity. And he no longer confuses love with emotional submission. This is the moment Nietzsche called transvaluation, the death of inherited moral lies and the birth of new values forged in clarity. From this point forward, the man sees love not as rescue, not as worship, not as merger, but as a choice made in strength. And only the woman who can meet him at that level remains. Freedom from emotional control is not the end of intimacy. It's the beginning of a different kind of love, one that requires more strength, not less. Most relationships are built on a trade: validation for obedience, attention for self-abandonment, emotional access in exchange for autonomy. And when you stop playing that game, the old framework collapses. But what replaces it is not coldness, it's clarity. You no longer love to earn. You no longer care to manage. You no longer seek to be needed in order to feel real. From this place, love becomes something else entirely. It's no longer a merger of needs. It's the collision of two sovereign trajectories, parallel, not entangled, aligned, not absorbed. She does not complete you. She complements what you've already built. And if she walks away, you remain whole. This kind of love has no drama because it does not require confusion to feel alive. It does not provoke crisis to test its depth. It does not disguise dependency as devotion. It is clean, quiet, and rare. But to attract it, you must become its mirror. You must be able to say no without fear, to walk away without collapse, to give without becoming indebted, to receive without becoming dependent. And this raises the question most men never ask. If love required nothing from you, no sacrifice, no surrender, no role to perform, would you still know how to give it?